The paper is really split into two halves, and the first of which is a quantitative analysis of reception figures and their distribution. And this sort of quantitative analysis is based on my own analysis of the existence of Herodotus in daily media, which found that through tracking the appearance of Herodotus chronologically and geographically, we could begin to see how interaction with the text changed and developed over time. And this is then followed by a small number of the available examples of the uses of Herodotus in the 19th century and how these relate to sort of wider patterns of engagement. Firstly, I'm sure in this room it doesn't really need to be said, but as with any study of the afterlife of Herodotus, it's sort of important to account for the changing reputation of Herodotus and that sort of dual nature of the father of history and the father of lies. And that's where the title of this paper comes from. And it's what sort of led Edward Gibbon to state that Herodotus writes sometimes for children and sometimes for philosophers. And yet, whilst the basis and complexity of the diversity of modern engagement with Herodotus is kind of exemplified almost in these two themes, and there is a lot of interaction with this sort of more widely and with a wider audience than you might be expected, most people were reading Herodotus for enjoyment and not particularly with an eye towards scrutinising the text. Yet it's still important to understand how much general audiences understood of a text, and that in itself is vital to the understanding of its receptions. And that's especially true if one is to take the view that receptions were part of a far more dynamic and multifaceted conversation than a linear approach would suggest. And an increased understanding of audience interaction with the text will help to provide a contextual grounding of it in any one particular place. So from the point of view of acts of reception, if we take reception studies to be part of a wider reader response theory of scholarship, then the creation of receptions, whether they be literary or otherwise, will only provide half the picture. Any allusions to Herodotus needed an audience that recognised and understood them, and if they were to be effective. Typically, levels of understanding of a text have been thought to decrease the further engagement moves away from an academic setting. And whilst knowledge of the histories is likely to have varied somewhat according to educational levels and social status, the work carried out here on the depth of engagement with Herodotus intends to corroborate the conclusion that there was no one demarcated audience for the histories. In order to achieve this, I've adopted various techniques, including part of the technique adopted by Franco Moretti, which is known as distance reading, where computational analysis of data sets is applied to large amounts of evidence to show trends and patterns that would otherwise be less apparent. And this is part of the digital humanities approach of creating large database sources that can be statistically analysed. Here I propose that by adopting part of this method alongside traditional literary close reading analysis, a more comprehensive view of the receptions of Herodotus can be achieved by accounting for those receptions that are more likely to get overlooked. Such a computational method is, in my view, at least a useful tool insofar as it complements textual analysis, and thus allowing for sort of large-scale evaluation of multiple texts, which then can help to enrich this narrower focus of literary study by providing different complementary scales of analysis. This interdisciplinary approach afforded by the digital humanities offers scope for the application of reception studies insofar as it can allow us to understand the historical context in numerical terms, namely where geographically Herodotus existed at any precise moment in time. The analysis in the first half of this paper will look at the existence of Herodotus in daily newspapers, and this amounts to some 30,000 individual pieces of evidence, which is a substantial data set. Part of the rationale for collecting large amounts of evidence in this way is to demonstrate that there was not any one narrative of the reception of the histories that was favoured, but that it can also demonstrate how an audience's understanding of a text contributed directly to engagement with and the creation of its receptions. To achieve this data has been collected and it relates either to advertisements for copies of Herodotus or for articles which make use of Herodotean content. This data has been mapped onto the 19th century census maps for England, Scotland, and Wales and shows engagement at a county level. The data has then been normalised per percentage of the total population figures to create hotspot maps, where the colour of a county corresponds to the levels of engagement per percentage of population. So the darker the colour, the more relative mentions there are to Herodotus. And this has been done for a 10-year period, 10-year instances between 1800 and 1899. So by charting the existence of Herodotus in daily media, I intend to demonstrate, somewhat tentatively, how feasible wide-scale participation and receptions have become, and that knowledge of Herodotus was meaningful and widespread and involved day-to-day interactions between the general reader and the text. Now, of course, when one discusses understanding, there is a certain amount of conjecture and goodwill involved in believing that what is being presented to an audience is being understood. And so for any kind of large-scale data analysis, there is a degree of sort of skepticism and good faith involved. But before I begin, there are some points to be made about newspaper readership patterns in the 19th century, which affect the data on display. It's generally accepted that most workers in towns had regular access to newspapers, and that from the 18th century onwards, newspapers were within their financial reach. This picture changes when we move into rural areas, with those working in agriculture being the least likely to have access to newspapers, but again, this expands as the century progresses. By the 1830s, the popularity of newspapers had grown so much that some cities saw the opening of dedicated reading rooms. And there were also union rooms that offered subscriptions from as little as a penny a week. And they were open from very early in the morning until very, very late at night to allow workers to use them around their working hours. And because of these facilities, it's estimated that every copy of a newspaper in Britain was read by approximately 25 people in the 1930s. And again, this is a figure that rises as the century progresses. And the ramification of this development is that the 30,000 references and adverts which involve Herodotean content are likely to have amounted to some millions of potential individual interactions across the country. Now, if we turn to the data itself and look at some of the graphs and maps, we take n-grams where the x-axis progresses at a rate of 1 decade per coordinate, and the y-axis represents the number of mentions to Herodotus. I can see from the 3 maps on the screen, which show a long 18th, a long 19th, and a long 20th century, just how unique the 19th century was in terms of interest in Herodotus. There's a slow but steady rise in mentions of Herodotus, which coincides with the advent of newspaper printing. This begins to rise dramatically at the turn of the century. This continues, and by 1850, there were 100 times the number of mentions as there were by 1750, where it reaches its peak and starts to slowly decline. If we then map this against the prevalence of material relating to Herodotus in book publishing, we can see a roughly similar pattern, with the exception of the late 18th century, though this could be explained by the relative lack of newspaper printing in this decade. Now, this map shows Herodotus in traditional book printing mapped against a like-for-like comparison with other classical historians. And it shows the extent to which Herodotean content dominated the publication market in regards to other historians. Interestingly, if you then map Herodotus against people like Homer, you get a different figure where he's sort of middling, but he's far more popular than a lot of the other classical historians. Now, surprisingly, Herodotus' popularity as a classical author stands out despite the tendency to see him placed for most of the long 19th century outside of the cohort of serious classical authors. And this academic snobbery seems to have had little impact on the popularity of the histories, and indeed its positing as a work suitable for readers likely helped Herodotus to reach the level of popularity he achieved. Now, Herodotus, over the course of the century, is mentioned in 380 different newspaper publications. These are both local and national, and are through all four nations of Britain. Geographically, this translates into material being published in 92 different counties. We switch to the map for advertisements. From the 1830s onwards, which is the fourth map on the top row there, we can see an exponential growth in advertisements, in advertisement data, and from the article data, we can see that that's far more stark. Now, from this, you can see that as the number of the number of physical articles which engage with Herodotus falls, the distribution doesn't fall quite as starkly. We can also see from these maps that the growth of this content is typically from sort of university centres outwards, but also from centres which have high levels of population density. And the fact that these articles and this engagement moves out of highly densely populated areas and areas which are large university centres is indicative of, in my opinion, genuine interest in histories beyond scholarly circles. And the maps which show the distribution for articles also suggest that there's quite a strong interest in Herodotus beyond a primary reading of the text. And this is also reflected in the fact that the geographical distribution for articles of Herodotean material stay consistently more geographically diverse. The possibility of such a widespread engagement with the histories has implications for the purpose and understanding of their receptions. First, it demonstrates a market for material from Herodotus that went beyond first-hand engagement with the histories. It also implies that when people were coming into contact with receptions of Herodotus, whether in the form of literature or visual material, they were far more likely to be familiar with where that material originated, even if they were unfamiliar with the source material itself. By highlighting the diversity of the interaction with Herodotus, it can be illustrated just how nuanced knowledge of the histories was. It would also suggest that even those who had not, or indeed could not, read Herodotus themselves were still able to achieve a level of understanding of the narrative of the histories, an understanding that would in turn allow for recognition and engagement with Herodotean content in other media. From this data, we can also begin to deduce numerous insights into how patterns of readership correlated with and in turn affected the creation of Herodotean receptions. As I mentioned, there are some overall trends, and we can see that areas of higher population, such as London and Yorkshire, have higher instances of engagements with Herodotus. By contrast, areas with lower populations, such as Wales and the Scottish Highlands, had comparatively lower levels of engagement. Yet whilst this relationship is apparent, it's by no means simple or conclusive, particularly as we move further towards the middle of the century. Areas such as Yorkshire and Lancashire, which have similarly high population figures, have different patterns of engagement for much of the century. And the same is true for Cornwall and Devon. One possible way to explain this is the difference in parish concentration. And areas which have a higher number of parishes typically can correspond to areas which have high levels of engagement with Herodotean material. This is likely to do with the concentration of clergy that were classically educated. One possible explanation for this anomaly, however, is also the relatability of Herodotus to certain counties. Newspapers in Cornwall, for instance, repeatedly make a connection between Herodotus' description of the tin isles and the county's tin production and trading links. And this presence of topical engagement with Herodotus and counties such as Cornwall suggests a limited interest which doesn't extend beyond first-hand engagement, in most cases, but which shows a very targeted topical interest. Now, if we return to the maps showing the advertisement of copies of Herodotus, these copies are new and second-hand and were sold in either bookshops or auction houses. The first 4 decades of the 19th century demonstrate a pattern of advertisement that's not particularly unexpected. Again, large university sites predominantly. But from the 1850s onwards, this concentration is less stark, and advertisements start to feature across a wider geographical area. This is likely a result of changes to education and printing between 1830 and 1880, which resulted in high levels of literacy and an influx in cheaper reprint editions, of which Herodotus is quite prominent. For Scotland too, this also likely affects changes to the Scottish university system and the 1858 Education Act. Now, the tracking of sales of copies of the histories is important in that it informs on three factors of the appearance of Herodotus for the period. First, it tells us which editions and translations were being sold. Secondly, it tells us where and how copies were being sold. And finally, it tells us how much copies cost and how their prices changed with printing developments. Advertisements alone here amount to 10,000 individual sales notices, or around a third of the collected data. Now, and it's clear from an overview of the evidence that major jumps in advertising correspond to the publication of different editions of Herodotus. So the translation of Bell in the 1780s, which is then reprinted in the 1820s and 1830s, Rawlinson's in the 1860s, and the editions of the 1870s and 80s by Swain and Sayce. Now, 2,500 of these sales were for copies of Herodotus in the catalogues of auction houses, where each advert mentions at least one copy. These auctions pertain predominantly to house clearances, typically death clearances and relocations, which entail the sale of usually whole sets of household effects, and books only made up a small part. And there were also some specialist library and liquidation sales. If we then consider the scale and frequency of Herodotus' inclusion in these auctions, two distinct trends become apparent. First, Herodotus was reasonably well represented in personal libraries. These are typically the libraries of deceased scholars, clergymen, or collectors, and they cover a wide range of translations and editions. But the typically ones that were more popular on the scholarly market. This changes somewhat as the century progresses, and in later decades, the more mass-produced translations of Bellow and Rawlinson begin to appear. But they also suggest a desirability for listing Herodotus for sale. Auction catalogues vary in size, but they're typically ranging between 500 and 5,000 books for sale at any one particular auction. And whilst the number of books in any one particular auction can vary tenfold, the advertisements themselves are roughly printed in the same size, with similar word counts. And from a perspective of attempting to chart the importance of Herodotus, this becomes interesting if we look at them as a part of sort of consumerist evidence. If an advertisement for a forthcoming auction has 100 to 200 words and lists no more than 30 to 50 of the works included for sale, then the inclusion of Herodotus amongst a select list tells us something about the perceived desirability of the text. But the remaining 7,500 advertisements are for those copies, both new and used, that were available from booksellers. These are typically recent translations and commentaries. The new editions are typically recent translations and commentaries dating from the late 18th and 19th century, whereas second-hand editions range from the recently published to specialist copies dating back to the late Renaissance, and you can imagine their prices vary accordingly. Most advertisements for Herodotus demarcate their intended audience, and there are examples targeted at scholars, students, school children, and readers who are just wanting to pick up the text for the first time. Those editions targeted at scholars and students are typically more specialist volumes and are usually sold at a higher price point. Amongst the most affordable of these texts was Littlebury's, and that still cost between 8 to 10 shillings, which is out of the price range of the majority of the public. And they also weren't as readily available. Similar translations like Gaisford's or Larcher's were more prevalent, but were far less affordable and were usually priced over £1. There were a number of non-specialist reprint editions aimed at general readers, and Herodotus was included amongst the first orders to appear in reprint editions, which were usually about a shilling. These early to mid-century reprint libraries overwhelmingly rely on the less accurate translation done by Bellow in the late 18th century, sorry. They changed to Rawlinson's in the closing decade, but for most of the decade, they do overwhelmingly rely on Bellow. And Bellow again was reprinted in serialized magazines. And reprints such as these were typically aimed at readers who were encountering Herodotus for the first time. They were also aimed at refreshing one's education. And there's a copy of Dr. Lardner's Cabinet Encyclopedia, which talks about Egypt and her pyramids and old Herodotus starting up before us, as people are encouraged to dive back into the texts that they would have been reading at school. And this highlights the breadth of engagement that existed, which can easily be overlooked. But data collecting such as this has also highlighted that some specialist editions were far more rare than others. And in order to truly appreciate the accessibility of Herodotus to readers in the long 19th century, it's not enough simply to evaluate the remediation of financial barriers and the opening up of book ownership to a more literate public. Evidence for one specialist edition, which existed in the 1900s and 1910s, shows far more comprehensive access to Herodotean material than had previously been realised. Within the collections of the National Lending Library for the Blind, there was a transcribed edition of A.G. Church's Stories from Herodotus, published in 3 volumes. With at least 300 active subscribers by the turn of the century, the library was sending out around 1,500 annual subscription requests to its members. This edition was then loaned, along with a collection of other blind accessible books, to Sunderland Public Library in July 1914, for a period of 3 months. This loan period suggests that it was also likely to have toured other local libraries, allowing access to such specialist editions beyond large centres like London. There's also a possibility that the lending of Braille copies of Herodotus to local libraries also removed the subscription fees that were attached to the National Library for the Blind. Sunderland Library became free to use in 1878, and there's no indication that the library charged loan fees for books that it had requested in. This evidence for the diversification of access to Herodotean materials is vital to ascertaining not only the increased availability of, but also the demand for the histories. Now, the implication of this is that whilst academic and more affluent markets were exposed to a full range of translations, for the vast majority of readers, this wasn't true. Most readers are likely to have met Herodotus through the text of Bellow or Rawlinson, if they were to have purchased a copy of the Histories in translation. And I suppose the question is, why does any of this matter? But an understanding of which translations of Herodotus readers were likely to encounter is important when one considers that levels of Greek language acquisition proficient enough to enable a direct reading of a classical text remained relatively rare for the majority of the period. As a result, most readers who encountered the Histories did so in translation. With limited access to Greek and thus a necessary reliance on one or multiple translations, it's interesting from both the perspective of attempting to ascertain readership patterns and of understanding the nuances behind perceptions of the Histories to see which texts readers were likely to be engaging with at any one time. Because without the ability to correct for inaccuracies within translations, we can see instances where inaccuracies have encroached upon secondary receptions of Herodotus. Now, if we move back again to engagement with Herodotus in articles, there's a slightly different picture which emerges. The type of engagement with articles usually takes a number of different forms. There are articles which focus on the reiteration of specific points of the Histories for the purpose of audience understanding. Retellings such as these can either be entirely focused on a single element from Herodotus, Babylonian marriage market is quite popular, or they can give details relating to specific topics. And I've got put two examples up there. There's a noticeable focus here on Egypt, which is perhaps unsurprising. And they cover a range of topics from customs to landmarks, contemporary archaeological discoveries, particularly those that corroborated or disproved previously disputed parts of Herodotus' narrative. There's lots of political discussion that uses Herodotus. This covers British and European politics, but also domestic and imperial matters. But the histories were used for sort of far less predictable topics, and these are the two that I've chosen. In these articles, see Herodotus being called upon to discuss especially good grain harvests, such as the square-eared French wheat, to lament the absurdity of contemporary fashion trends. Hats are a very popular connection between Herodotus, or to enable the transmission of jokes. Now, articles typically more evenly distributed, and that geographical distribution grows rapidly between the 1800s and 1830s, and after which it's largely static. Now, the inclusion of Herodotus into newspaper articles is greater quantitatively and geographically, but there is a correlation between the hotspot centres and, again, areas with sort of higher levels of advertising typically see higher levels of article engagement. Yet, unlike distribution of advertisements, article engagement is far wider, and so by the end of the long 19th century, there are only a very, very small number of counters which have had no interaction at all with content from the histories in this form. And only those areas with very, very low levels of population density have had no exposure at all. And so this then is indicative of the extent to which the population of Britain had come into some contact with Herodotus, however limited. They indicate that by the end of the long 19th century, there was potentially a high amount of low-level contact with Herodotus in most parts of Britain as a result of newspaper readership. This could range from high levels of understanding of very small sections of the histories, such as Herodotus' description of the tin arms, which is the article on the right of the screen there, or connections between Herodotus and specific topics, such as Egypt, or simply a loose association between Herodotus and classical content. The spread of Herodotean knowledge through daily engagement of this sort had a direct impact upon the creation and comprehension of subsequent receptions, and that's really what the second part of this paper is going to try to demonstrate. And the following selection of examples are a small number of the uses of Herodotus that have links between the receptions and either the reporting or the background links within newspaper articles, which helped to enhance public understanding and interaction. I'm going to cover three sets of examples in this half of the paper. And the first is a personal use of Herodotus. The second is an artistic use, and the third is a mix of the two, which connects Herodotus to contemporary political events. So, skip through that. Now, connections were made between Lord Byron and Herodotus in the public imagination for a number of decades, but these carried on after the poet's death. Byron had used Herodotus quite extensively in his poetry, but what I'm going to talk about here is the skull cup on your screen, because it's slightly more fun and slightly more obscure. Now, we know Byron's friends were familiar with his admiration for Herodotus, but also his personal use of Herodotus. And with the publication of the Memoirs of Thomas Medwin, which were published 6 months after Byron's death, so were a lot of other people. Medwin was the first cousin of Percy Shelley, and he published a work called Conversations with Lord Byron. And it became so popular, largely on account of Byron's own celebrity, that the year it was published, there were 500 mentions of it within daily newspapers. And there's about 30 of them which mention a Herodotean curiosity which belongs to the poet, and that is a silver-gilded skull drinking cup. The skull, which was reportedly found buried in the grounds of Byron's ancestral home in Derbyshire, Newstead Abbey, was transformed into a version of the Scythian drinking cup mentioned in Herodotus Book 4. Now, the Herodotean passage says that The Scythians took, and I'll read out the passage, the skulls of their enemies, that is, not all skulls. They saw off the bottom part of the skull at the level of the eyebrows and clean out the top bit. The poor Scythian then wraps a piece of untanned cowhide tightly around the outside of the skull and puts it to use like that. While a rich Scythian goes further. After wrapping it in cowhide, he gilds the inside and then uses it as a cup. Byron's cup fits the description given by Herodotus of that which would have belonged to a wealthy Scythian, though Byron's appears more elaborate than its ancient counterpart. The skull is cut at the level of the eyebrows as described in Herodotus, while the inside has been polished and sealed. It does feature a silver rim for drinking and a rather elaborate silver stem and foot, which is decorated with elements from the Byron family crest. Contemporary readers at the time of publication of Medwin's book responded with their own reactions, and there were poems published quite widely in newspapers which called for the skull to be reinterred. And these were in part also reacting to a poem written by Byron in 1808, 16 years earlier than Medwin's book, entitled Lines Inscribed Upon a Cup Formed from a Skull. Medwin's book links the skull directly to the Scythians, which suggests that at least he and more of Byron's close circle were fairly aware of where the idea had come from. And it's also mentioned in the diaries of Nathaniel Hawthorne, which were published in the 1870s. He visited Newstead Abbey and talks about being presented with this cup. If anybody wants to, you can still see a replica of it in Newstead Abbey today. Yeah. Descriptions of ancient cities, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, proliferated in connection to Herodotus, particularly in the first half of the 19th century when there wasn't as much archaeological evidence available. Descriptions from Herodotus were reported throughout the national press and were used to inform a number of major artworks, including two produced by Northumbrian-born artist John Martin. The first in the set, finished and displayed in 1819, depicts the fall of Babylon to Cyrus's forces. Martin himself states Herodotus as being amongst his sources, and the histories were used to provide stylistic and historical information for the creation of the Tower of Babel and for the city walls. The early 19th century had witnessed an increased interest in ancient cities such as Babylon, and a reliance on historical sources like Herodotus were particularly apparent given the relative lack of material evidence. In the years leading up to the showcasing of the painting, atlases depicting the ancient world became increasingly popular, and new editions of Reynolds geographies were included amongst them, including the circulation of an auxiliary map derived from Herodotus, which illustrated the expected remains of Babylon. Because of this reporting, and Babylon is already being connected to Herodotus in the public imagination, Martin received critical praise in the national press for resorting to all authorities that could furnish information for his pictures. And by the time Martin came to paint the 1829 work, The Fall of Nineveh, his connection to the histories was well established. The imagery creates the scene of the fall of Nineveh at Herodotus 1.106, and Martin, in the catalogue which accompanied the painting, discusses Herodotus as providing source material for the image. Herodotus is used extensively for architectural detail, though by his own admission, some of the detailing was taken from Herodotus' account of Babylon. There's also a conscious effort to recreate the military attacks described in the histories, and at the centre of the bottom right of the frame of the picture on the left, we can see what Martin describes as the Persian forces storming the city. And it's very difficult to see on such a small screen, but up close you can see that the capitals of the pillars are decorated with wreaths of serpents, which Martin says he took from Herodotus' description of the Temple of Bel. In the newspaper articles published weeks after the initial exhibiting of the image, there are accounts given of the passage from Herodotus and descriptions and explanations of how it connected to the painting, which are provided according to several newspaper articles at the request of readers who wish to know something more about the history of the painting. And for about a month afterwards, while the paintings were still quite popular and in the forefront of people's imaginations, there are articles coming through which directly link Herodotus and Martin's work. And the final example that I have here is for a painting by William Etty. Really to demonstrate that there were a lot of political uses of Herodotus as well, and these filter through into both art and into literature. In the wake of the Peterloo Massacre, during which 18 people died after cavalry charged into a crowd of around 60,000 who were protesting for parliamentary reform, there was a rise in anti-monarchist sentiment in Britain. And one story in particular from Herodotus became explicitly linked to this movement. When Etty recreated his own version of Herodotus 1.10, in which the Lydian king Candaules convinces Gyges to watch his wife as she undresses, the story was already explicitly linked to anti-regal sentiment. The subject matter of the story and the shock which often accompanied it was likely the cause of its infrequency, and the story was used sparingly in the 19th century. And indeed, this painting proved so controversial as to threaten Etty's recent investiture as a royal academician. And it's perhaps the reason why Etty produces the only well-known version of it in British art, though there are several surviving European examples, particularly from the period of the French Second Empire. Some critics suggest that the breaking up of the body of the king was intended as a continuation of the Herodotean narrative, gesturing towards the role the queen would go on to play in the death of Candaules. And it connects varying social commentary elements. It's classically voyeuristic and it's usually criticised on those grounds. So the Literary Gazette criticised it for being against decency and good taste, continuing that as an academic study, the central figure of the group might be admissible, but in connection with the disgraceful story, it deserves to be formally reprehended. Similar sentiments were expressed in the Bell, who refused to cover it on the grounds that to us the subject matter is so offensive we pass over it entirely. And the painting is also described in the 1855 biography of Etty, written by Alexander Gilchrist, as almost the only instance among Etty's works of an undeniably disagreeable, not to say objectionable subject. And in each of these, the Herodotean narrative behind the painting is as controversial as the explicit nature of the painting itself. This suggests that the objections to the painting were as much a result of the connotations of the original narrative as they were of Etty's application of the female nude. As with the use of Herodotus by Martin, this was a topic that was discussed across media and usually in a very, very critical way. And any other instance of the story that appears in newspaper articles, or at least the ones that I could find, usually use the scene as a descriptive measure. They describe sort of what's going on in Lydia, or they'll use it to describe certain elements of the bedchamber scene. They always leave out the regicide. But I did mention briefly that Etty's creation of the image was already connected to anti-monarchist feeling. And another member of the Romantic Circle had used the story directly in response to the Peterloo Massacre. In poet Barry Cornwell's 1820 collection Sicilian Story, the tale of Candaules' downfall is retold in the narrative poem Gyges. The poem features the bedchamber scene as described in Herodotus, though in Cornwell it's Gyges who's the instigator, rather than sort of reluctantly accepting Candaules' insistence. This scene then roughly follows the course of the Herodotean story up until the point at which Candaules is killed. The death of the king is still the critical point of the narrative, though in Cornwell's version, Candaules is given poisoned wine as opposed to being stabbed to death in his own bedchamber. Yet the poet highlights that the importance of the ending of the poem is the death of the king. And the final line of the poem is, and having killed the king, why that's the main. Now, Herodotus does go on to explain how Gyges lived on. In the following chapters, give an account of his reign. So should Cornwell have wanted to carry on with his retelling of the histories, it would have been easy to do so. And this suggests that for the purpose of the poem, it simply was enough to have killed the king. The choice to use the Herodotean narrative then was deliberate, given its publication shortly after the Peterloo Massacre, and that it was published in Leigh Hunt's literary pocketbook, which for its 1820 edition featured a number of works containing anti-monarchist themes. This suggests that the use of a regicide narrative was part of a wider response within this one work. But it wasn't, however, a response that came without wider criticism and critique, and a publication of Acilian's story in the London press described the satire of Gyges as being a blemish on the whole collection. And a lot of the public criticism of it keeps this same sentiment. It's very much a sentiment that this is the poem that goes against public feeling. And in this sense, the poem sort of moves beyond typical representations of Candaules' story, which does focus on voyeuristic connotations, and ties the narrative to contemporary events. And these contemporary events were part of a wider social conversation and a wider political discourse, and they were reported in the press as such, and they were always reported with a link to the original story. And so to conclude, there are several benefits to grounding receptions of Herodotus, and by extension also other authors, alongside quantitative analysis of the wider existence of the histories in the public imagination. This distance reading approach is important insofar as it helps to ground secondary understandings of text in real life. A better understanding of how Herodotus was used in a given period demonstrates not only that receptions of Herodotus were invariably diverse, but also that they seldom existed in isolation from other receptions or from the world around them. More than that, however, they all tell us something about the diverse ways in which audiences interacted with Herodotus. From political commentary to court documents, anecdotes to culinary content, there were very few topics into which Herodotus was not included. And this shows how readers and the general public were used to seeing Herodotus and material from the histories repackaged in a number of different ways. And their frequency strongly suggests that the public were likely to have understood an array of engagements with Herodotus as a result of the frequency with which they came into contact with this material. But the responses to some of these receptions also suggest that where there may have been ambiguity, there was a real sort of push to take some of that ambiguity away. The range of available material, coupled with the high concentration of Herodotean content which was produced in daily media publications, suggests a strong awareness of the content of the histories amongst a broad section of society. And this understanding would have varied considerably amongst different groups, but it remains apparent that because of the quantity of material available, Herodotus enjoyed a diverse and expansive audience, though one which interacted with his text in varying degrees of depth and detail. Ultimately, our viewing of engagement with Herodotus in this matter is intended to further examine the spread and impact of perceptions of the histories, to demonstrate the intricate and thought-provoking manner with which the narrative was approached, and to highlight the benefits of emerging research techniques such as the digital humanities for the study of classical receptions. Thank you very much.